Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of our class here. I see that most of you have already introduced yourselves on the Moodle page, and good. I try to respond to everybody who has introduced themselves, and hopefully everybody read everybody else's. That way we kind of have a sense of who we're working with in here. We're going to get going here on Virginia and New England and some Pennsylvania too. We'll start here with just sort of a map of the Chesapeake region in general, which is the sort of when we say Virginia, we mean the Chesapeake region mainly. And if you look here, so this the English settlement by 1650 in this sort of green area here. And if anybody's interested in where I'm from, it's actually right here along the coast of Maryland originally. So this is the area that we mean when we're talking about the settlement of Virginia. We have to go back to England. King James I actually gives the corporate charter to the Virginia Company, and it's a corporate charter, meaning the Virginia Company has the authority to settle this territory. And if anybody is wondering why there's this one particular city called Jamestown, it's because King James gives them the charter, so they name the first city that they settle after him. The Jamestown is named after King James. Also, this river right here along Jamestown is named after King James. So that's sort of where that comes from. And now, as part of this class, we do want to dispel some myths if we can. And the first myth that I really want to tackle in this class is the Pocahontas myth, romanticized by the Disney version most especially, but there's also been romantic versions of it. The Smith Pocahontas tale since the early 1800s. And the real story was that Pocahontas, the real Pocahontas, was way too young to be romantically involved with Mr. Smith in any meaningful way. And actually, Smith never actually said that it was a romantic entanglement, but he was quite the exaggerator, so the real story there may never fully be known. So we're probably most familiar with the Disney version. Here is a contemporary. You can see the date here. Excuse me. We can date it to 1616, and this is what she would have been dressed as when she visited England. She visited England at one point, so this is what she probably would have looked like a little bit more in the contemporary sense. And here is an etching of John Smith. So just so you kind of have a sense of who we're looking at, who we're talking about in real life. Now, these are some of the lecture topics that we're going to go over today. So we are going to do Virginia and New England, and we will try to talk a little bit about Pennsylvania. And when you're talking about early Pennsylvania, it is exclusively, we're talking about Quakers and Quakerism there. So if you just want to write some of this down, I'll give you a chance to click pause and write it down. But these are the topics we'll go through. And I'll come back to Pocahontas just briefly here. Her English name, when she was given an English name, which unfortunately a lot of Indians, Native Americans who became involved with the Europeans were given European style names. So Pocahontas, when she was given a European name, was renamed Rebecca Rolfe after John Rolfe. She probably wasn't romantically involved, like we said, with John Smith, so she ended up marrying Rolfe later on in life. So mythologically, she becomes something of an honorary founding mother of the nation, and it does become a little bit complicated later on when we get to severe segregation and parts of U.S. history wherein you're not white people can't mix with other colored peoples, Native Americans being one of them. So there is a little bit of what I would think is confusion here. But there are exceptions made for Pocahontas because a lot of Virginians in the sort of the upper echelon of Virginian society, the aristocracy, if you will, did claim descent directly from Pocahontas. And some of these people include Edith Wilson, who was married to President Woodrow Wilson, and Nancy Reagan, married to President Ronald Reagan. They both claimed direct descent from Pocahontas. And this, as part of the purity laws, the racial purity laws that were passed in the United States, became the exception because of this founding mother sort of mythology that surrounds her. And then we have on the bottom there, she's the exception in the racial purity law passed in 1924. So she has been a national figure for several hundred years, kind of since the inception. She's a founding mother. And even today, there is something of a mythology that surrounds her still. And just to bring it back to the relationships between Virginians at the time, so we're talking about the Jamestown settlements in the early 17th century with the local Indian tribe, which Pocahontas would have been a member of, the Powhatan tribe. They are okay for a little while, but they deteriorate rather quickly. And by 1622, we get the first of many Indian massacres in the Virginia settlements. So about 1/3 of Jamestown was massacred in 1622. This would have been about 350 or so Virginians, members of the citizens living in Jamestown, and we have a woodcut here depicting this only a couple years later. This was a surprise attack, and it was provoked by some territorial expansions. So this would have been the Virginians venturing out into Powhatan lands sort of without their consent or knowledge, and that's really where that surprise attack came from. So relations there don't stay good for very long. And the reasons that the Virginians want to explore out into the countryside, if you will, is because the main crop that comes out of Virginia, and I'm saying crop there, C-R-O-P, the main crop is tobacco, and you need land to grow tobacco on because tobacco is becoming a very lucrative crop back to in Europe. People are starting to smoke more. They use tobacco for a lot more things. So this is why they are trying to expand. Sort of a nice transition to the other colony here in New England. And this is the modern day site where you can go see Plymouth Rock. It's got 1620 carved into it. That's not the real rock or anything. I don't think it's just a tourist attraction where they get you to come up to this railing with about 1,000 other people who are trying to take a picture of the rock. You're not allowed to touch it or anything. And if any of you have been there, you know what I'm talking about. It's not as exciting as one would hope for. But this legendary founding at Plymouth Rock is another American favorite. And these types of origin stories are forever being retold and represented in popular culture. And here we just have a few different of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, just some depictions there. So they've always been kind of a favorite in American history, the founding at Plymouth Rock by these Puritans leaving England. The first Thanksgiving is another popular founding myth, and not, I mean, there's some truth to it because it's just been retold so many times that the sort of the history gets lost there. But this one is a painting dating from 1914, so 300 years or so after the actual event. This is just another one of those founding sort of mythological events in the origins of the United States that we all seem to learn about in elementary school, and we know the stories pretty well. Yeah, here's another image from actually much, much earlier, a little bit more contemporary to the actual first Thanksgiving that I think depicts it a little bit better and a little bit more naturally. You can see the Indian tribe and the colonists working together in this earlier imagery. And just as part of this lecture here, I want to mention that similarly to in Virginia, the um, relationship between the Indians and the colonists was pretty good at first. It sort of deteriorated a little bit later on. Not, we're not at the point of a massacre just yet, but we're getting there. So they are some good relations in the beginning, but the Puritans they didn't have such a favorable view of the Indians. One of their seals, the seal of a Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was this New England colony, its statement says, "Come over and help us," and this illustrates the English conviction that they were over there. They were going over there to liberate this native population, rather than exploiting them as other empires had, like the Spanish. We talked about the Spanish exploiting the natives they encountered with that encomienda system, and like the French, they didn't want to necessarily exploit them quite as much. But in reality, it doesn't always work out quite as well as it does in theory. So this is sort of propaganda, an early form of propaganda, if you will. And what we want to say about this Elizabethan settlements in general, and when we're talking about the Elizabethan settlements, Queen Elizabeth is the Queen of England at this point in history. So when we're talking about Elizabethan settlement, which is a difficult word to say, we're talking about settlement during her reign. And almost exclusively, it's all about religion. This is the Anglicans, and the Anglicans means the Church of England, headed by the Queen, sometimes the King, but in this case the Queen, versus Catholics versus Protestants. And the compromise was that the monarch here is the head of the Church of England, so everybody else sort of has to find their own way. And Puritans, so we're familiar with Puritans from the New England colonies. and what they want to do is purify the Church of England. They were actually Calvinists in sentiments, and there's actually more than just one branch of Puritans. I mean, they they spread out. There's different types of dissenters against the Church of England. Presbyterians, Congregationalists fall into that category. Sometimes you'll hear the Puritans being called the Separatists. They ended up moving to the Netherlands at first. So if we go back here to this map of Europe that's kind of crudely drawn looking, you'll notice that, so here's England. The Low Countries here, this is where Belgium and the Netherlands would be. And they moved to the Netherlands at first because you think of the Netherlands, you think tolerance. Well, that's what they thought too. So they move to the Netherlands, but they thought that there were too many sinners there. And if anybody knows some stereotypes about Amsterdam, for example, you're familiar with the sin that goes on in the Netherlands. Not to disparage a whole country. I hope you know I'm just doing this in jest. So they end up leaving the Netherlands, and then that's what leads them eventually to the Americas, and especially up here. And this is the New England area. These are the modern outlines of states. You can see Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire and Maine up there. But initially, so the Massachusetts colony is in this sort of bluish pink blob, bluish purple maybe, and it extends. So this whole area here is kind of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Then we have the Plymouth Colony, which is distinct for a little while. The Providence Colony, which becomes Rhode Island in this little red. And then down here is Connecticut, which is different still. And then the New Haven Colony is different even then. And you can see down here, this is modern day New York City. But remember, we talked about New Amsterdam. Well, while the Puritans and other religious groups are settling in New England, there is still a heavy Dutch influence in what becomes New York City. So here's a painting of John Winthrop, who was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's actually given a charter by the Queen to set up this colony, and that's where Massachusetts Bay sets up. And what makes it distinct up here, so he sets up here, and then Plymouth becomes distinct because of that religious tension that we talked about before. The Puritans didn't want to settle necessarily with the Congregationalists, so it is a little bit different, and that's why there are these different colonies here. But this is John Winthrop. He is the first governor of Massachusetts Bay, who you might have heard of before. That's why I bring him up here. But then, like we mentioned, and like happened in Virginia, relations sort of sour, and we get our first big conflict in New England between the native populations and the colonist populations. And we get the Pequot War of 1637, and this is the first big conflict. It's actually the Puritans versus the Pequot Indians. And these Puritans, they're not happy. They were not happy with just winning. What they ended up doing was killing or selling into slavery all Pequot men, and essentially trying to erase the Pequot name from history books. So this is one of these early versions of like some serious big wars going on between these Indian tribes and the Puritan settlers. The next big war that we get is King Philip's War. This lasts for a year between 1675 and 1676. And King Philip's War involves massacres on both sides, Indians massacring Puritans, or colonists in general, and colonists massacring the Wampanoag Indians in general. And we get out of here some captivity narratives, which you can probably find in our library, which are kind of interesting. And they sort of get this, what these captivity narratives are when Indians would take prisoner colonial whites, keep them in their tribe for a long time, and if they ever returned, some of these white people who were captured would write what's known as a captivity narrative, where they describe their time in the Indian tribe. So there are sour relations between the Indian tribes and the colonists, but that doesn't stop the colonists from trying to fulfill what they consider their religious mission there. And you might have heard of this thing, the City on a Hill speech delivered by John Winthrop, who was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he's calling here for the Massachusetts Bay to become sort of a symbol for religious settlement in the New World. And it's just sort of these high ideals that sometimes they live up to, and oftentimes they don't live up to. That's delivered, though, in 1630. Elsewhere, we have this guy, Roger Williams. He founds Providence Colony in 1636, and that becomes later on the state of Rhode Island much, much later, but it's founded as Providence Colony. And so who Roger Williams is, he's actually a dissenter from Puritanism. So the Puritans dissented from the Church of England, and now we're getting dissenters from Puritanism. He ended up leaving Boston, which would have been in Massachusetts Bay, for Salem. And this is where he begins establishing his own colony for religious reasons. So he establishes some and starts preaching these doctrines of dissent against the Puritans, but he also establishes this doctrine for the separation between the church and the state. He thought that religious compulsion by the state was not going to be effective, and that's what you found in some of those Puritan settlements, was that they had this idea of religious compulsion. Roger Williams, on the other hand, said you couldn't force people to be believers. They had to do it by themselves. He also took up the cause of Indians, because he didn't like some of the massacring that had gone on both sides. He was dissatisfied with the Puritans as well as dissatisfied with the Indians who were involved in massacres. But that dissent right there, that's what actually gets him exiled, and where he starts to go to found Providence Colony. But the Rhode Island state or colonial charter does say that there can be no state-enforced religion, so this is sort of an early precursor to one of the amendments to our Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights there. Now it brings us to the question of whether or not New England was a place of religious freedom or religious intolerance. And the example we'll go with here is Anne Hutchinson. This is her portrait on the right-hand side. She was also a dissenter in New England. Her doctrine that she taught was that you can learn religion through direct divine revelation, whether or not you were already saved. And that doctrine actually got her banished in 1638. She ends up going to Rhode Island for a little while, later on to New York. Eventually, she was killed in an Indian raid, but some of the stuff that she talked about were these Puritan heresies, what we're going to call Arminianism and Antinomianism, which are difficult words to say. But Arminianism here is the belief that practitioners of good works can earn salvation, which sort of flies in the face of Calvin doctrine that said this predestination idea, dealing with whether or not somebody was already saved. And the predestination idea says that it is determined before you're even born whether or not you would be saved. So this Arminianism that Anne Hutchinson talked about was that you could earn salvation through good deeds, whereas the old style of predestination, you were already determined whether or not that you were saved. And now this antinomianism, this here is the belief that God speaks directly to the saved. So if you have been saved, God would talk to you. And these are some of the heresies that Puritans preached against, but people like Anne Hutchinson preached in favor of. Now we're moving on to the next, dissenting groups that we'll talk about here, which are the Quakers. And we got to start talking about the Quakers with the English Civil War, which lasts for almost a whole decade in the 1600s. And this is a problem in England itself. And what ends up happening is that this English Civil War, they're revolting English people against the king, Charles I. Charles was a little too Catholic for many Anglican tastes, but he was pretty tolerant overall. But that didn't stop these Puritan Anglicans, not to be confused with the Puritans in general, Anglicans who were not big fans of Catholicism in general. So it leads to the Civil War, wherein Oliver Cromwell, this gentleman on the right here, who ends up leading the revolt, and King Charles ends up being beheaded. And so this is that in imagery. It lasts, Oliver Cromwell's dictatorship, if you will, lasts for about a decade, and by 1660 we get the restoration of King Charles II, and by 1660 he rules until 1685. And what ends up happening is that these Quakers emerge from the Civil War, and what their doctrine teaches is that all earthly titles are wrong, and they refer to each other as friends. So they're not big fans of dictators or kings or queens. They're against the monarchy, they're against nobility, and Charles II ends up allowing them to leave England, and they go establish their colony in the in what we'll call the New World, and it's founded by this guy. He is independently wealthy. His name is William Penn. He's a leading Englishman. He's actually a member of the nobility in the beginning, but he renounces that because Quakerism says you can't have one of these titles. So William Penn is given this large land grant. What ends up happening is after he renounces his nobility, he becomes the largest non-noble landowner in the New World for quite a long time. And that's somebody who is not an aristocrat who owns land. And William Penn, if you look at the etymology of the word Pennsylvania, that's where it comes from. Pennsylvania is named after William Penn. Now, the Quakers, their sin, according to the Church of England, was that antinomianism that we talked about. They are persecuted as heretics because they believe that God can speak directly to the saved. So that does make them something of a bit of outcasts in England. That's when they end up coming to what's now Pennsylvania. And now we see, I just have an image here of William Penn signing a treaty with the Delaware Indians, and you think that the Delaware Indians are exclusively from what is modern day Delaware. That's not entirely true, because Delaware does extend, the Delaware Indians do extend into Pennsylvania for most of their history. And now the Quakers, they do establish good relations with the local Indian tribes through nonviolence. It should be emphasized that the Quakers today are associated with nonviolence. In the 17th century, they were associated with nonviolence too. They are beyond just Bartolomé de las Casas, who we talked about last week, one of the first groups concerned about slavery being morally wrong in the New World. There are actually a lot of Quakers involved in the slave trade for a while, but by the 1670s, they are calling slavery evil and a moral wrong. And they don't make it a government demand, but they strongly urge people to give up slavery. And that lasts until the 1750s and 60s, when they really start demanding it as a government-issued action. So the next little topic we want to move on to is the diversity of North America, British North America, by the mid-17th century or so. You can see on this map that there is a rather diverse population. This greenish area, this would represent the Church of England, the Anglican Church. So the majority of people, and you got to remember that not all of these areas are completely settled at this point. These blobs are just sort of helpful guides. But you can see sort of where we are, which I guess would be right around this area, was mostly Anglican through the 17th century, and it gets a little more diverse when you go up north. And the reason for that is that the largest populations of migration taking place is going to New England. So we see to New England here, there's about 20,000 to the Chesapeake colonies, Maryland and Virginia. And, you know, sort of North Carolina is included in that. There's about 5,000 by 1635, 1645. And then we can see that also there's about 20,000 people going to these various islands and what we're calling the West Indies. And just to zoom it in, this is where people are mostly coming from in this sort of blobbed out area down here. So this would be the points of origins in England up here, where they're coming to in this case just the Massachusetts and Plymouth colonies. And now, so by the time of the English Civil War in 1660, these would be the areas mostly settled by European colonists. And don't be fooled, they're not as big as they look. You can see Spain down here just has this little territory around St. Augustine in Florida. France, just this little area up here around Montreal and Quebec. England, so it's more coastal than anything. And then we even have the Netherlands, who are still sort of hanging out for a little while in 1660. Now these would be a zoomed in map of New England and Maryland and Pennsylvania. These were charter areas. Delaware established in 1664, New Jersey 1633, Pennsylvania 1643. So these are the areas established with charters beyond just the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies and Providence colonies by towards the end of the 17th century. So with all these colonies established, a lot of them are becoming quite profitable, actually. And there is a fear, especially in some of the more religious colonies of New England and Pennsylvania, that the original religious mission of the colonies is fading away. And as response to that fear, we get in some cases, what are known as witch hunts. And that's exactly what you think it is. Probably the most literal and famous example would be in Salem, Massachusetts, where we get the Salem witch trials, which you might have heard of once or twice in your lives. And it starts with this one West Indian slave. Her name is Tituba. This is an image of her here, wherein she confesses to certain degrees of witchcraft. She was from the West Indies, the Caribbean islands, excuse me, where she would have been practicing voodoo as her religion, and that in New England to them looks like witchcraft. So she ends up confessing to witchcraft, and this whole series of events unfolds, and I guess most eloquently told by the movie, the name of which I forget, which I just remembered is The Crucible. It was originally a play by Arthur Miller in the 50s as sort of an allegory about the communist witch hunts in the U.S. government during the time of McCarthyism. Take US 2 with me, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But in reality, it was a real witch hunt, and upwards of 20 people were tried and some executed for witchcraft in the Salem colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, in modern times, there is a growing scholarship on Tituba and the Salem witch trials. So there's a lot of new books on her who depict her as an African, and there is some debate about whether or not she was actually a New World Creole or Indian, or whether or not she was actually an African slave. So that has come up, and I've got a couple examples here of modern scholarship debating this question. Now, what I want to do is show you a series of maps on this PowerPoint that'll sort of get us set up for next week when we start talking about the slave trade. And I'll probably return to these next week just to sort of give us a heads up of where we are. Just to start with this first one here, it shows these on the outskirts of, I mean, it's the modern United States, but on the outskirts of the colonial world, we've got some French forts there. And remember, we said there's fewer French immigrants than the other European countries in the 17th century, and what they're doing is mostly just trading. As far as the English colonies, sort of this whole area here, which we think of as the original 13 colonies or so, this is where they're mostly hanging out. And what they're doing here, well, there's that map again. So we have these different types of colonies, though. We have royal colonies, which mostly up in this Massachusetts Bay Area, also Virginia, and even a little bit down here in northern Georgia. What those are is they are chartered by the crown, the king or queen of England, set them up, established them. Now what we have here, proprietary colonies. Those are colonies that are kind of there exclusively to make money, if you will. We also have a corporate colony. That's modern day Connecticut. That would be the Providence colony. And they are kind of, I don't want to say a mixture, but a mixture of these two here. But you also see that there's British holdings down here in Belize and Jamaica and some of these islands, the Bahamas Islands down here. So these are the colonies, what they're set up for. It gives you populations and sort of the export incomes. So the West Indies islands down here are a lot more lucrative than the South or even the North. Especially, and so here we have it in shillings as a type of currency in the English world. So we have pounds and then shillings. Think of it as like money and cents, maybe. So here's another map that just sort of illustrates these colonies along with some Indian tribes that are here. And you'll notice that, so here's the Delaware tribe. I said they're not just in Delaware, which is actually right here. They're mostly in Pennsylvania and then extend all the way out here into modern day Ohio. But then also maybe towards North Carolina, the Catawba and the Yamasee. Also, you notice that there's Cherokee kind of all over the place down here. I think they're associated with North Carolina especially. But this one will just kind of give you a sense of where some Indian tribes are in relation to these colonies. This map is sort of an ethnic breakdown group. So Africans, of course, they'd be brought over as slaves, but there's some Dutch up in here. They're sort of mixed in, English all over the place. There's even German immigration through the 17th century, but they're mostly, I guess you'd call them Appalachian people at this point. But, they're kind of all over the place. Scotch-Irish down here where we are, a little bit in Pennsylvania, Scots exclusively, sort of down where we are, North Carolina, South Carolina, some Swedish even in western New Jersey, and then Welsh, which is just a state within England, so Wales, that's up more towards this area, northern New Jersey, western or eastern Pennsylvania. So that's kind of the ethnic breakdown. Here's the religious breakdown. I think we looked at this one before. So here's some churches designated by these triangles. Interestingly, there's not a sizable, but I would call it a sizable Jewish population that's moved into some of the major cities in New York, what becomes New York, and here in northern New Jersey. So there's a sort of a large variety of religious groups that are moving in to the colonies. So here's another map that I was toying around with about that sort of illustrates some of the immigrant groups ethnically broken down, or nationalities broken down a little bit better. So you got your Germans in Western North Carolina, also the sizable English population, sort of where we are right now. So here's, just a good breakdown of ethnicities. And then so this will set us up pretty well, I think, for next week when we're talking about the slave trade. And I will return to this map again, but this is where slaves are coming from. You can see up here. So this is the enlarged area down here where slaves are coming from. And these are the total numbers over the course of the whole of the slave trade. And here it is zoomed out. This would be called the Middle Passage. So this is where they're coming from and where they're going. You can see some moving to Europe, fewer moving to what becomes the United States. They're mostly going to South America and some of these islands down here. And we'll talk about why next week. So here's even more zoomed out of a map of that. So this is just sort of to get us going, to get us started. This map shows kind of this triangular trade between Africa and the Americas and Europe. So what's going where? And we will return to this map next week. I do have this one here, which sort of narrows it down a little bit more and shows you the major trading centers in North America. And that should get us set up for next week. So thanks for bearing with me. Remember also to watch the crash course videos that I upload, and I will explain hack questions now on a different PowerPoint or video. Thanks.